Hello, my name is Jörg Matthes from the University of Vienna, and I'm going to talk about incidental exposure to political information on social media. And the key question for me today is, does it really matter for democracy? So what are the relevant outcomes for democratic society? Why is this topic relevant? Of course, as outlined in many theories of democracy, a knowledgeable and engaged electorate is key. People need to be interested, people need to learn something about politics in order to participate, in order to fully engage with a democracy. However, given social media and given the abundance of information to use social media and to be in contact with your social network, people may also tune out of politics. And in fact, there are studies demonstrating that people are become less and less interested in political matters and rather enjoy all the other entertaining possibilities they have when they use social media, for instance, on their smartphone, engaging with others, entertainment, sports, and so on and so forth. However, it has been argued that this may not necessarily be a problem for democracy because in a typical news feed, people may also get incidentally in touch with political information. So even those people who are not interested in politics may still stumble upon political information without actively looking for it. And such incidental exposure to political information may have important outcomes for our democracy. And that is, in fact, the hope that political communication scholars have expressed when it comes to social media. Even though people may not be interested, they still may be exposed to political information, and this may, in fact, matter. So, several scholars have consequently looked for the relationship between incidental exposure to political information and various outcomes, such as news seeking, knowledge gains or learning, political participation, or political discussion. And in those studies, incidental exposure to political information is typically defined as exposure to political information on social media that individuals did not intend to be exposed to in the first place. And this is also how it's asked in survey questions. So typically people are asked, well, just think about how often did you encounter political information without actively looking for it? And these questions are then correlated with outcomes such as learning, participation, and intentional exposure. When we look at prior research on incidental exposure to politics on social media, there is a clear research gap. And my colleagues and I have outlined this in a recent piece on the incidental exposure model to political information. And we argue there that incidental exposure clearly lacks a coherent conceptualization. So when you look at how scholars have defined incidental exposure, it varies a little bit from scrolling past content to reading or more closely reading an incidentally encountered article. So these are definitely several levels of how people could deal with incidentally encountered information. In addition, there are also conflicting findings. Well, some relationships are conditional, they depend on other characteristics. Some relationships are positive, some are small, or some are non-significant. So there is quite some heterogeneity in the research literature when you try to look at what are the outcomes of incidental exposure to politics. Lots of studies, one could say, but the patterns at the core message is a little unclear. In order to disentangle this picture, we have suggested a theoretical model that makes a couple of key distinctions, helping to clarify the nature of incidental exposure. This is the so-called PINE model that we have suggested in a journalism last year. So in an article which you see down there, the political incidental news exposure model, the PINE model. And very briefly, in this PINE model, we argue that people have a processing goal. So they want to process, for instance, non-political information. And now it can happen that people incidentally see also political information, although they were not really the goal was not really to process political information in the first place. And this is what happens typically when you scan your newsfeed. So you are engaged with non-political information, and all of a sudden political information comes up. And then the question is, how do people react to this political information? And we say at the heart of this model, something takes place what we call a relevance appraisal. So people very quickly and automatically scan this content and appraise whether it's relevant or not relevant. If it's not relevant, they remain with their original processing goal and process the non-political information. However, they have seen the political information in passing. If the political information is appraised as more relevant compared to the non-political information that is in line with the original processing goal, then we argue that people switch their processing goal. So then the non-political processing goal can turn into a political processing goal. And this is what we call the so-called second level incidental exposure. So in a nutshell, we say there are two different types of incidental exposure to politics on social media. The first level means, well, you're not really interested in the political information you see, you scan it, you quickly realize it, but then you really go back to your non-political content. Second level incidental exposure means you appraise the political information that you stumble upon incidentally as relevant. And then the processing goal changes and you deeply engage with the political content. And this is obviously something completely different. So in the one case, incidental exposure could mean that you quickly scan information that you believe is unimportant. Whereas in the other case, it means you switch your processing goal and you deeply process the information that you saw incidentally on social media. And this is what we call first level and second level incidental exposure. In addition to that, we also distinguish between intention-based and topic-based incidental exposure, because we argue you could also be incidentally exposed to political information about another topic when the actual processing goal was related to a very specific topic. And this is what we also explain in the paper, but this is not relevant for me today. This is the incidental, this is of the PINE model in a nutshell, as an overview. I'm not going to detail it here. Just the main idea is that the question, is there political content? Yes, then there will, people are exposed to political content. They will engage in a relevance appraisal. If this is negative, they go back to their original processing goal. That simply means they have seen it in passing. However, if the relevance appraisal is positive, there's a change in processing goal, and then they deeply process political content. Here, this is the second level of incidental exposure. And also, you could have a specific political processing goal, and you could incidentally be exposed to non-political content, and the same could occur. So just reverse the logic in our model, and you could also say people have a political processing goal, but they get distracted by non-political information on social media. I'm not going to talk about this today, but it's also relevant, because if you see that on social media, political information and non-political information just goes hand in hand and immediately occurs together and cannot really be separated from each other anymore, then both perspectives are decisive here. Let's turn to the main assumptions. I said that our main interest was to distinguish between the first level of incidental exposure and the second level of incidental exposure. And we say that the first level, that means briefly glimpsing at incidentally encountered information, may leave some kind of memory traces, and we could call this process passive learning. And we know from psychological research that passive learning has small effects, perhaps not as big as effects as you would hope in terms of democratic theory. However, the second level of incidental exposure may lead to much stronger effects, because it's based on elaboration rather than passive learning. And in what follows, I will present you a couple of findings that me and my team have collected on this question of how incidental exposure affects political outcomes. And we start with a meta-analysis we have conducted, and we are going to present at ICA in a couple of weeks. And in this meta-analysis, we sampled the available evidence, survey evidence on incidental exposure, and we looked at various outcomes such as news use, political knowledge, political participation, and political discussion. And we found 47 distinct samples with almost 40,000 different respondents, and we are also currently updating this meta-analysis. It's important that for this meta-analysis, of course, the distinction between first level and second level incidental exposure is not there, because this is a novel concept we have suggested and you don't find it into literature. So here we only look at incidental exposure as a broad concept as it has been used in the majority of the studies. And what we see in this meta-analysis is that when you really look at the correlational evidence, you find very strong effects of incidental exposure on all those outcomes. However, if you only look at the panel studies, then of course the findings are much more mixed and less stable. In panel studies, that means the autoregressive effects, and the autoregressive effects are taken into account. You only find effects on news use, but no effects of incidental exposure on knowledge and participation and discussion. That means if people stumble upon information on social media, it may boost further news use, for instance, because of clicking on something, but not necessarily directly political knowledge, political participation, and political discussion. So the findings are a little mixed here, and we don't see a very clear outcome when it comes outcome of incidental exposure to all those different variables. In a second study published in the Journal of Communication, we did an experiment in which we manipulated the processing goal and the relevance appraisal. And here we could actually test the Pine model. And in this study, we found that if people engage in the second level of incidental exposure, then in fact they learn more in the second level. They are more likely to recognize a headline, more likely to recall a story, and also more likely to recall the content when they clicked on it. So a second level relevance appraisal leads to more attention, more likely to learn the political information in this study, and it also makes you more likely to click on the political information, which then in turn also leads to learning of the content. So we find clear evidence in this study that the second level of incidental exposure leads to learning of political information. There are some indications in this study that also the first level may lead to learning effects, small learning effects, although we cannot prove this causally in this experimental study. Then we turn to additional evidence, and here we did a couple of panel studies, and I'm going to show you only one here, a couple of panel studies on the outcomes of incidental exposure to political information. And in this study, we actually measured first level and second level incidental exposure. And we did that by creating a scale to be used in surveys, where we specifically ask whether people just process the information in passing without really paying attention to it, first level, or they saw something incidentally and then they really engaged in a deeper processing of it. So we developed a scale for this first and second level incidental exposure, and then we looked at how this first and second level incidental exposure scale is associated with various outcomes: static knowledge, surveillance knowledge, online participation, offline participation, social media use for political information, it means more intentional exposure, and political opinion expression. And for those various outcomes, we saw that both the first and the second level had some effects in an autoregressive panel model controlling for the prior state when trying to explain a later state. So such autoregressive models are important because otherwise all the evidence is only correlational. And in this autoregressive panel models, we saw that both first and second level could positively predicted online participation, although the effect of the second level was much stronger. For offline participation, ironically, only the first level was related to online participation. However, we saw for social media use, again, and also for political expression, that only the second level was positively related to those outcomes. And in the paper we've just submitted, we also added other panel studies, and by and large, we see that the second level of incidental exposure to political information is more likely to predict those outcomes compared to the first level. So, to sum up, incidental exposure to political information on social media, does it really matter for democracy? Well, I think it's safe to say that the outcomes are more nuanced than previously thought, and the positive hopes that initial scholars on incidental exposure have expressed when it comes to the potential benefits of incidental exposure may perhaps be a little overrated, because we say it depends what kind of incidental exposure we are talking about. Are we talking about the mere scanning of content that you're not really interested in? So you don't want to see it, but you just get exposed to it in your news feed, but you don't process it in a deeper way. This is first level. Or are we talking about incidentally stumbling upon political content that then leads to a deeper engagement with that content and also to learning effects? And our findings by and large clearly suggest that only the second level of incidental exposure is relevant or significant for democracy. The first level may have some small effects, but these are rather small and shallow compared to those intentional elaboration of the content. And this has a number of important research implications. First of all, how can we explain if people engage in a first or in a second level of incidental exposure? And this is something we are currently working on. We're looking at individual level characteristics, content characteristics, and those characteristics. And there we're trying to predict what are the factors that actually help us to understand when people are more likely to engage deeply in incidentally encountered information. And also, based on our model, we believe that incidental exposure has to be studied much more dynamic and less static than it has been previously studied and understood. Why? Because if you think about what's going on in social media, you are constantly exposed to information on social media in your newsfeed, and it all is mingled together, political information, non-political information. And what may happen is that people constantly switch and constantly engage in relevance appraisals. So they may have a non-political processing goal, get incidentally exposed to information and switch to political processing goal, and then see entertainment information and switch back to a non-political processing goal. And this goes back and forth over time as a dynamic process. And what we need to look at after all is how does this dynamic look like for each individual? For some, the relevance appraisal may always be negative. For others, the relevance appraisal may always be positive. Yet for others, it may be a constant switch between positive and negative relevance appraisals. And this has completely different outcomes. So if we really want to understand the effects of incidental information to political information, we need to conceptualize in a much more dynamic way. And also, we need to look for the opposite effect as outlined in our PINE model. The opposite effect means, well, people are actually interested in political information, and they have a processing goal in line with the political information, but they get incidentally exposed to non-political information. So what happens then? This potential leads to distraction and to outcomes that are less relevant for democratic theory, so to less learning and less participation. And if we ignore those effects, we end up with a one-sided picture and one-sided conclusion on incidental information. So it's important to take those distraction effects also into account in this research area. And finally, as has been apparent in the meta-analysis, but also in the panel study, we need to deeper look into the interdependencies between the dependent variables. So if we have, for instance, learning, participation, expression, and other outcomes, the question is, how do they relate to each other? And if we want to understand how incidental information to politics on social media affects democracy, the relationships may be rather complex and involve several mediating mechanisms between those outcome variables. Thanks very much for your attention. If you have questions about my presentation, please get in contact, and I'm happy to further discuss this with you. Thanks again, and all the best.